Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Houston Center lecture. Before I say anything else, I have to tell you that to note that tonight's event is being recorded and live streamed, and that you may appear or be heard on the recording, which will be published on our webpage. This is a public policy announcement we have to make in case you're caught picking your ear or doing something that you don't want to be seen doing on the live feed. My name is Jens Zimmermann, Professor of Theology and Director of the Houston Center here at Regent College. The Houston Center fosters interdisciplinary and interreligious dialogue on the central question of the late modern world: what does it mean to be human? The question is obviously of central importance because what we desire and how we act always depends on explicitly or implicitly who we think we are. Hence, at the Houston Center, we explore the conceptions of human identity that underlie our current social and political practices. To state the concern of tonight's lecture, the question is, can science show us the good? And this is obviously an important question that naturally falls within the Houston Center's mandate to reflect on human nature and what it means to lead a good life. To state the concern of tonight's lecture a bit more precisely, our speaker is asking whether natural science, by means of its empirical method and research, demonstrates universally normal moral preferences. Can there be a natural science of morality? That's the question. And I confess that for anyone with training in philosophy and the history of ethics, this seems to be a rather rhetorical question and really a category mistake. I mean, to envision a natural science of morality seems to me like someone who enters an auto body shop to purchase a painting or an artwork. But yet there are those who enthusiastically announce that science can demonstrate what morality is and how we should live. For example, I came across this a while back. Sam Harris, one of the four horsemen of the New Atheism, in his book, The Moral Landscape, is convinced that natural science can finally settle what morality is, and that will finally free us from religious and metaphysical differences, right, that we always have when we talk about morality. I also remember a hugely controversial essay, much earlier than that, by the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, about 20 years ago. And in that essay, Sloterdijk suggested that progress in modern biology will soon produce a shift from a humanistic culture to a biological culture. And the humanistic culture is the idea that education, reading, and instruction through interpersonal traditions helps to shape human beings and helps them to learn how to become, a responsible citizen. The kind of stuff that we do, I think, at Regent College and at the universities. You do this kind of formation. Scientific culture, then, said Sloterdijk, that will soon come, will replace this cumbersome method of moral education through drugs and genetic engineering and the like. We will finally realize, he thought, that morality is really biology, which we can then control by scientific means. The question is, of course, at least the one that would immediately come up for me, is who does the controlling? And according to whose values will the controlling be done? Who determines what kind of human being we want? You can imagine the outcry Sloterdijk's essay produced in Germany, a country in which the memory of the Nazi controllers and concentration camps for eliminating the unwilling opposition was still a living memory. And so moral science may also make us feel uneasy today when governments seem to have found a new taste for surveillance and for crowd control. What I'm trying to say is the stakes are high. This is a really important question to ask. And so I'm happy that tonight we have with us a speaker who is addressing this question. Paul Nedelisky is Assistant Director and a Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, which is an interdisciplinary think tank that aims to understand the deep structures of cultural change and culture's impact on the common life. He's also co-author with James Davison Hunter of the book Science and the Good, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality, published with Yale University Press in 2018. And that's the book on which tonight's lecture is based, right? Good. The first part, okay. Thank you. So in addition to the history of science and morality, Paul's research interest also centers on metaphysics. His work in this area concerns the nature of the fundamental constituents of reality, the basic building blocks of the world. He has won several teaching awards. He's a great communicator, I can tell you that. And he is published in a number of journals, including the Hedgehog Review, the Journal of Value Inquiry, and Teaching Philosophy. So Paul will speak for us on this topic for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a respondent whom I will introduce at the time, because by that time you'll have forgotten who that was. And then we will open the floor up to questions from the audience. So that's the program. Please help me to welcome Paul Nedelisky.
Well, thank you, Jens. I also want to say thank you to John Nolan, to David for responding tonight, to the Houston Center and to Regent College for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. Everything is connected to everything else. This is both a blessing and a curse for the philosopher. I set out to talk about one thing, and as you'll see, I wind up talking about everything. But to put a more positive spin on it, think of tonight's lecture as a buffet with a little something for everyone. The gossamer thread that ties everything together this evening is the question of the relationship between nature and the good, between the world that God has made and the realm of value. In the first half of the talk, we'll dwell on a matter of what we might call political epistemology. Specifically, how can we find values and an ethical vision for society that we can all agree on? Here I will tell the story of how the modern West has tried to find this ethical vision through science. In essence, I'll be giving an overview of my book with James Hunter, Science and the Good. The subtitle of the book refers to this quest to find a scientific basis for morality as a tragic one. So I don't think I'm giving too much away to say at the outset that this quest has failed. But this path to failure is, I think, an interesting one, with some twists and turns, and the retelling will be worthwhile. However, this failure also sets up the second half of the talk, because it introduces a perplexity. The perplexity is this: science is typically taken to be the primary, if not only reliable method for knowing about nature. The job of science, so to speak, is to tell us about the natural world. So if science cannot tell us about the good, then what does this mean for the relationship between nature and the good? Is nature good? How can we tell if science can't tell us? If nature is good, then where and how does it show up in our experience? Overall, I'll ask and answer two questions. One, can science tell us what is good? And two, if science cannot do this, then how can we understand the good in nature? I could have titled the talk like this: Part 1, why science cannot show us the good. Part 2, why science can show us the good. But let's start with Part 1. In 2012, when James Hunter and I began writing the book, the question of science and morality was having a moment. Here are 15 books that were published between roughly 2005 and 2015, each of them arguing that science can tell us the nature of morality. Our book came out in 2018, and nobody, as far as I know, has written a book saying it could be done since then. Coincidence? Actually, it is a coincidence. What really happened, I think, are two things. One, North American public culture is increasingly moving away from a traditional moral values grounded in tradition and place, and is instead embracing a materialist, instrumentalist, status-based ethos that we might call a meritocratic ethics. This new ethics has a clear place for science, for if our idea of the good is achieving certain material goals, then science is certainly helpful for figuring out how to do this. It's kind of a technical project. If the good is making money, then there is a technical, broadly scientific path to figuring out how to do it. There's only a question about the science of morality if our idea of morality includes things that aren't empirical, like transcendent goods or moral duties. Two, the conversation became overtly political since our book came out because of the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, it became clear, in many cases at least, that science was being used not as an impartial guide to reality, but rather as a weapon of opportunity, instrumentally co-opted toward whatever one's vision of the good happened to be. I had friends who didn't like masking, and so they were always posting articles that showed how masking, caused harm, and friends who thought masking was a good idea, and it went back and forth. I'm sure each of us has seen examples of this. Because of these two developments, the question of the science of morality is now likely to be met with either, well, of course science can reveal the good. That's how I knew I should go into finance. Or something like, maybe science could in principle show us the good, but the research is so politicized, who can say? So the public appetite for a science of the good may be currently somewhat reduced. But what James Hunter and I found as we dug into the history is that this boom-bust cycle is recurrent. This is because interest in a science of the good is tied to problems and motivations that are essential to modernity itself. Let me explain. The impulse to use science to find the good first emerged in the European wars of religion. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic reaction generated calamitous religious disagreement and persecution, class conflict, and a pretext for political division, which culminated in many bloody wars. For instance, during this time, the area we now know as Germany was hit very hard, losing up to a quarter of its population in the conflicts. This might be hard to see, but this is a little timeline, courtesy of Wikipedia, that shows the little sub-conflicts within the European wars of religion and roughly when they happened. I don't know if it might be too small to see, but you can see they all start right about around 17. No, shortly thereafter. Perhaps the most burning question of this time for intellectuals was, how did this violence begin and how can it be stopped? Thinkers significantly focused their blame on the religious disagreements. Since religion led to the chaos, or so it seemed, then religion cannot show us how to live. It can't be the foundation of morality. But if not religion, then what? What could play this role? Serendipitously, the scientific revolution was underway at the same time. These are some of the bigger names kind of showing where they show up in this timeline. While everyone disagreed on religion and were killing each other, the first modern scientists were deploying the empirical method to reveal the workings of nature and to compel agreement on these matters. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. In this context, Dutch legal scholar Hugo Grotius and the English philosophers Thomas Hobbes and John Locke came up with scientific approaches to morality, just to show where they kind of show up in this scene. They're at the top in the blue. Each of their names is roughly around the time they were writing. These innovators shared the same impulse. What we need in both politics and morality is a method for getting people to agree instead of killing each other. These three disagreed on what that would look like in politics, but they agreed on the morality part. Science is the answer. Ever since then, science has remained an obvious solution to any form of disagreement, not least moral disagreement. The science of morality became a perennial flower, though its shades and forms would vary over the years. In the late 18th century, Englishman Jeremy Bentham introduced a new twist. He helped devise utilitarianism, which ignores all allegedly moral phenomena except for good and bad consequences of actions. And on this basis, he sought to turn ethics into a calculus, the kind of thing you could demonstrate. David Hume and Charles Darwin, a bit later, further changed the game. Under their innovations, the science of morality moved away from trying to prove the existence and truth of an objective morality and moved it toward the understanding that morality arose from the way our minds had developed over time. On this sort of view, morality isn't something that we find out there, but is rather something we feel and hear in our minds. Then jumping forward a bit, in the 1970s, the science of morality experienced another renaissance with the appearance of sociobiology. Sociobiology, and its founder E.O. Wilson, who I think David might mention in his response, incorporated social dynamics and neuroscience into the Darwinian picture to form an evolutionary cognitive science. This is an incredibly brisk retelling of this story. There's many details that I'm already talking for 50 minutes, so I won't go into too much more detail here. But if we analyze this history of development, we can see that scientific approaches to morality have taken one of two forms. There's kind of two general strategies that these different approaches would fall into. One, they attempt to directly demonstrate the truth of this or that moral claim or view. For instance, Hugo Grotius, maybe the first person to attempt this, the science of morality, he tried to demonstrate the basic laws of war and peace when he was working in the 17th century. He made a direct analogy to empirical approaches. He was saying, look, here are two very obvious facts we can discern about human nature, and from these we can figure out what the laws to promote peace and prevent war would be. Or Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian calculus in the 18th century, or Sam Harris's approach that Jens mentioned in his book, The Moral Landscape, where he tries to demonstrate the truth of utilitarianism. We can call this the prove it approach. Or two, kind of the second strategy, they attempt to use science to explain human moral judgments and feelings, thereby reducing the realm of morality to something else. The something else is always empirically intelligible, consistent with the naturalistic motivations of those in this movement. For instance, Hume makes morality a kind of feeling. The Darwinians understand morality as a byproduct of survival pressures on genes and social groups. We can call this the reduce it approach. But as Hunter and I were reading the contemporary moral scientists, we were surprised to discover a third kind of approach. Here, a number of recent authors have actually abandoned genuine morality, the idea that things are right or wrong, or good or bad. Instead, they see morality merely as a matter of achieving goals or positive emotion. This is not really morality because the goals and positive emotions may be tied to amoral or even immoral ends. If your personal goals are money, status, or fame, the achievement of these isn't ethically good in itself. So this new approach functions as a sort of moral nihilism. The moral nihilists mostly try not to advertise this fact by continuing to use the language of morality. By reading their less popular, more technical works, we're able to figure out, for instance, that of these 15 books, 12 of them take this nihilist position, although only one of them openly admits it, in these popular publications at least. In every case, the claim they claim they take this position because of their philosophical commitment to naturalism, the idea that everything that exists must be describable in the language of empirical science. So in a way, the moral nihilists actually share Hunter's and my verdict, as I will soon describe, that science cannot detect morality. But whereas we say, so much the worse for the science, they say, so much the worse for morality. This can sound a little sinister, especially calling them nihilists. It just means they don't think morality is a genuine phenomenon. But my sense is that most of these folks are not intentionally being insidious. They're simply imbibing their sense of morality, or lack thereof, from the culture in which they live. Like many elite institutions today, and that trickles down honestly into the milieu we all find ourselves in, the academy is a cosmopolitan yet insular, status-obsessed, meritocratic culture where achievement is the goal and where achievement is largely a function of instrumentalizing most aspects of one's activities. You can sub the word academy out for a lot of other institutions or realms of life, and oftentimes this will be an accurate description. This is depleted soil for the growing of genuine goods and virtues, and so it's unsurprising that many fail to see morality as anything but accomplishment of various life and social goals, and that's then how they describe it. After this kind of formation, when they turn to philosophy and science to figure out what they think is going on in the realm of what people call morality, they wind up classifying as nihilists. As we say in the book, when it began, the quest for a moral science sought to discover the good. The new moral science has abandoned that quest and now, at best, tells us how to get what we want. With this term, the new moral science, for all its recent fanfare, has produced a world picture that simply cannot bear the weight of the wide-ranging moral burdens of our time. What we see from this speed run through the history is that the science of morality has been present essentially ever since its emergence in the wars of religion. The motivations are usually the same: the desire to use empirical demonstration to overcome moral disagreement. If science can make people agree on the structure of the carbon molecule, then why can't it do the same for what's right and wrong? But after 400 years of efforts, what does the science of morality have to show? Has there ever been a demonstration of morality, of any moral law, of any obligation in any situation? Perhaps surprisingly, the answer is no. Not surprising to Jens, but to some people, it's surprising. The closest any of these approaches have been able to come is telling us about various human processes and actions related to morality, like which parts of the brain appear to be used in moral thought, or what things people tend to believe to be right or wrong, or speculations on how our moral faculties might have formed. These are interesting observations and theories in their own right, but they tell us nothing about what is right or wrong, good or bad. So why is this? Why the failure to produce results after roughly 400 years? Why haven't many of humanity's brightest minds been able to figure this out? After thinking about this history and reflecting on the nature of the concepts themselves, Hunter and I draw this conclusion. A demonstrative science of morality is impossible because the basic phenomena of morality and ethics are indetectable to empirical methods. Goodness, evil, obligations, duties, human rights, virtues, all such inherently ethical elements cannot be detected, at least by instrumentalist empirical methods. There is simply no physical or detectable causal aspect to any of these. Take, for instance, your obligation to care for your children or other family members. Evolutionary psychologists theorize that care for family members is advantageous for passing on one's genes, and this is true and demonstrable. But this tells us nothing about why one ought to care for one's family members. After all, suppose you knew that your family members were unable to reproduce. Would that diminish your obligation to care for them? Of course not. These obligations are experienced, you might say detected, by us, not by instrumentation, detected by human agents, but they arise from the social and spiritual significance of the gifts of life being entrusted to us through God-given familial processes. Everyone in your family has material parts, but the basis of ethics and your obligations to them isn't found on this level. What is much more common in attempts to scientifically locate morality is that researchers think they are doing empirical science when really all the implications from ethics have come from philosophy they've unintentionally smuggled in. Don't get me wrong, I think philosophy can be a valuable tool for understanding the world, but it is rarely capable of the sort of proof that can compel widespread agreement. There's an often quoted line that runs something like, "There's no view so insane that some philosopher somewhere hasn't endorsed it." And there's constant disagreement amongst the philosophers. But that's supposed to be the whole point of a science of morality, to find some method that would produce that kind of agreement. The impossibility that prevents a genuine science of morality is that you can have either a descriptively accurate moral term or moral terms, or you can have terms that you can empirically demonstrate, but not both at the same time. If you accept that morality necessarily involves things like goodness and duties, then you have adequate terms for the phenomenon, but you can't empirically detect or demonstrate them. You can't prove that this or that is good or empirically detect a duty. On the other hand, you can redefine morality in empirical terms, like defining goodness as promoting the survival of the species or as maximizing pleasurable feelings. But then you find that you're using terms that only accidentally and occasionally overlap with good things, and very often lead to results that are quite evil. For these reasons, the quest for a science of the good has failed. It's understandable why we keep trying it, but it would be better if we could recognize that it can never succeed, at least on these terms. And so we come to part two. Understanding how the category of the good fits into the natural world has been a problem ever since the West traded in an Aristotelian philosophy of nature for the modern scientific conception of the world. That's a little hint about what direction I'm heading now. Modern science proceeds by making empirical observations and then uniting these observations in explanatory theories. But like we've just discussed, the good cannot be empirically detected. As a result, modern science has been unable to tell us much, if anything, about it. I think this empirical approach has played a big role in the marginalization of the good in our understandings of nature. But so too has an often implicit metaphysical idea concerning the basic structure of reality. I have in mind what is called the primary-secondary quality distinction. It's a terrible title. It doesn't trip off the tongue, but making it into an acronym, PSQD, is not any better, so I'm just going to have to keep saying it. Roughly, the primary-secondary quality distinction is between the way things seem in our experience, the phenomenology of things, and the way they can be objectively demonstrated to be, regardless of how we might experience them. For example, my father, when he had coronavirus, he lost his sense of taste. He would eat a fresh chocolate chip cookie, and to him it would taste like ashes. The way the cookie tasted to him is, according to this distinction, a secondary quality of the cookie. But regardless of how the cookie tastes to my dad or anyone else, there are some things about it that do not vary with the subject's experience. The cookie objectively has the mass that it does. It objectively has the dimensions that it does. It objectively has the chemical structure that it does. And these are the primary qualities of the cookie. There is a principal difference between the physical and quantitative properties of a thing on the one hand and the non-quantitative experiential qualities of a thing on the other. But the crucial question is, which of the two kinds is really primary and which is really secondary? How we answer this question has significant implications for how we understand the natures and identities of things. Since the turn to this modern scientific conception of the world, the quantitative physical qualities have routinely been seen as more important for understanding what things are. For the early modern philosophers, the variation in our experience of things was enough to undermine the importance of experiential qualities in understanding the world. They surmise that what is fundamental are the spatial and quantitative qualities of things, often shorthand called the mechanical qualities. Here's Galileo making this argument in brief. This is a quote from him, translated in English. But that external bodies, to excite in us these tastes, these odors, and these sounds, demanded other than size, figure, number, and slow or rapid motion, I do not believe. And I judge that if the ears, the tongue, and the nostrils were taken away, the figure, the numbers, and the motion would indeed remain, but not the odors, nor the taste, nor the sounds, which without the living animal I do not believe are anything more than names. Just as tickling is precisely nothing but a name if the armpit and the nasal membranes be removed. Many affections, which are reputed to be qualities residing in the external object, have truly no other existence than in us, and without us are nothing else than names. That's Galileo. Before we go further, we must notice something that I think is of signal importance. If sound, this conception amputates every quality that requires a perceiver, or really any quality that cannot be accounted for in terms of spatial and quantitative terms. This includes the good. For, as noted previously, the good cannot be understood even in broadly empirical terms, let alone a smaller subset of these in the primary physical and mathematical qualities. So one upshot of this early modern version of the primary-secondary quality distinction is that the good is something we read onto the world, but which is not really there. However, this implication is in deep tension with the traditional Christian understanding of creation. As Christians, we know that God made the world to be good, and objectively so that goodness is a part of nature. But more importantly for my purposes here, in addition to suggesting that the goodness of nature is a mere projection, this modern scientific conception gets things upside down. It prevents us from seeing goodness in the correct relation to the rest of creation. Goodness is not merely part of creation, it's the telos of creation, the point of it. The explanation, the reason for the being and nature of each thing is the specific and even particular good it contributes. Let me say more about this. When I was a child, I enjoyed playing the Nintendo video game, The Legend of Zelda. I had to play it at my friend's house because my parents wouldn't let me have my own system, so we became real good friends. To play, you navigate this elfin character through fields, caves, and castles, battling enemies and collecting treasure and weapons toward ultimately rescuing the Princess Zelda. Now suppose you try to understand the video game purely in terms of a physical description of the machine parts of the game cartridge and console. Superficially, the machine parts may appear fundamental because, after all, that's what causes the game to run, which causes it to play. However, if you think about it, you can see that it is for the sake of the phenomenology of the game as the player experiences it, including the characters and the storyline, that the machine parts exist at all. The machine parts were designed to support the experience of the game. The phenomenology of the game of Zelda explains the nature and existence of its underlying physical causes. That's why they're there at all. Here, the traditional primary-secondary quality distinction gets the basic structure of nature and the good backwards. The project is not to explain how the material qualities of things and their parts add up to give us goodness. Focusing on the mechanical basis causes us to misunderstand nature, much as focusing on the mechanical basis of a video game would cause us to misunderstand the telos and nature of the game itself. In fact, the reason the physical basis of anything exists is to play some role on behalf of the good contributed by the creatures that God has made. The physical is not fundamental, but instead exists for the sake of the good things that they help compose. I think you can kind of think about the underlying physical parts of things as servants or as messengers that carry the phenomenological qualities of things. It's a bit picturesque, but there's something I think right about that. The good then is fundamental, and this locates the good in nature. The unity of nature and the good lies in the fact that creation is teleologically ordered to the good. But at what level is the good of nature located? How can we see it? Is the good found at the level of the very small parts of things? At their atomic, chemical, or cellular structure? It seems not. It rather appears that the purpose for which the parts of a thing do what they do is the activity of the whole organism. There's this great poem by a poet named Christopher Smart, and there's a part of the poem called "For I Will Consider My Cat Jeffrey." If you've never read it, I recommend looking it up. And he's describing his cat, and it's this beautiful, theologically informed observation of this mundane animal that I think really helps reveal the catness of cats. The good of a cat, according to Smart, and I think for any of us who watch them, consists in part in its ability to creep and stalk and pounce. They're pouncy things. The good of a human being is primarily found in his or her relationship with God and with other people. We can pursue these activities in part due to the labors of our less fundamental mechanical features. So it seems that the mechanical features exist for the sake of these medium-sized organisms. I say medium-sized just because they're bigger than the microscopic stuff and smaller than really macroscopic stuff like ecosystems or the cosmos. These medium-sized created beings are those that Aristotle called substances, and which we might call whole organisms. The sunflower, the magnolia tree, the pileated woodpecker, the horse, the dog, the man, the woman. This appears to be the proper structural level at which to locate the good in creation. If this is right, it has profound implications, I think. It means, among other things, that the macroscopic observation, the sort of interaction with reality that each of us is capable of without instruments, is at least as important to understanding reality as the microscopic empirical science, given as it often is, to understanding things as a function of the workings of their smallest parts, has no epistemic priority over our ordinary experience of reality, provided that we are conscientious in our observation. Accepting the necessity of ordinary experience in understanding creation is a significant revision to our contemporary assumptions about the primary role of scientific inquiry. For if it is observation of the whole organism that is central, then suddenly something like the visceral majesty of a lion is one of the most salient and noteworthy things about it. Outside of academic contexts, I think this is probably obvious. This is why we go to zoos or try to observe animals in nature. Yet no contemporary biological investigation is going to notice this. David has some good pushback on this point, but I'll let him make his point. But I submit that something similar holds for all life forms, not just in the case of lions, just an illustration. This looks bad for current biological science, but in fact the situation is even worse. We've discussed the fact that organisms have teloses. They are for various ends. The trouble is that the identities of things, the identities of organisms, what things are essentially bound up with these teloses, their objective purposes. To put it colloquially, if you want to know what something is, you have to find out what it's for. Or as they say in automobile advertisements, form follows function. This is one of the deepest and greatest legacies of Plato and Aristotle, but it's also common sense, given the origin of creation in a creator. God's purpose for each thing is definitionally why he made it, and therefore constitutive of what it is. But if each created thing is for the peculiar good that it contributes to the world, and if this peculiar good is constitutive of its essence, then since empirical science cannot tell us about the good, it follows that empirical science cannot tell us what any created thing is. This is the wildest claim of the night, but I want you to hear what I'm saying. Don't misunderstand, the biological sciences can often individuate organisms by something approximate to species. They can get the taxonomy roughly right, I think, in many cases. And perhaps sometimes they can give necessary and sufficient conditions for correctly picking out the species. But this falls short of telling us what the essence of a creature is. Let me elaborate on this a bit more. The biological sciences tell us a great deal about organisms at deep genetic levels, cellular levels, and in terms of how they fit into the ecological systems of which they are a part. This is important and obviously requires detailed empirical investigation. But while a creature cannot be completely understood apart from its genetic makeup or cellular processes and role in the ecological system, these are not the whole story. Really, they're not even the most important part of the story. As for its mechanical parts more generally, the purpose of the very small in an organism is to support the special goodness contributed to reality by the whole organism, the living thing. Here we might hear the objection of a biologist. Isn't the purpose, the telos of an organism, given by the role it plays in an ecological system? And so doesn't investigation of this role tell us what we need to know about the telos of that organism? In a word, no. For while the ecological role may be part of the telos of a creature, eventually we must grapple with the fact that many distinctive features of the organism, its colors, visual pattern, habits, dispositions, are contingently tied to its role in an ecological system. In other words, current biological science wants to explain the appearance and behavior of each organism in terms of how these qualities enable it to survive and reproduce. After all, if the explanation for the nature of an organism is its development via a purely naturalistic evolution, then there's nothing else to appeal to. Certainly, surviving and reproducing is part of the point of it having the features that it does. But the connection there isn't necessary, let alone essential. Each creature needs features that enable it to survive, but what we can observe is that the goodness of these features far surpasses what is necessary for survival. Consider one class of examples. Many creatures have strikingly beautiful colors and patterns in their appearance. These striking features may serve to advertise availability for mating or to warn of venom or toxicity. In this way, their appearance helps them survive and reproduce. But why should it be striking patterns and vivid colors that play this advertising role? Why couldn't it have been a small but distinct skull and crossbones symbol on their head? Why couldn't it have been something like a UPC code? Why shouldn't organisms have developed binary readers whereby specific coding informs them of sexual availability or toxicity? Then everything in the world could have been just a patternless monochrome gray, but yet all the information processing that makes for survival still could have been achieved. Channeling Louis Armstrong, and I think to myself, what a functionally adequate world. The point of this bleak meditation is to illustrate that the specific qualities, the variety of colors, patterns, behaviors, dispositions had by organisms aren't necessary for their biological role. Natural selection of features with the same adaptive and ecological function could have been achieved in any number of very boring and disappointing ways. This is my attempt to kind of illustrate the idea. Here's some of the things that the organism needs, some of its interactions with the environment, very oversimplified. The discernible beauty of living creatures is gratuitous on these terms. The world is dappled, spangled, and pied in myriad biologically inexplicable ways. There's what a real pumpkin seed looks like. But as theists who recognize a good creator, it should be obvious this is no accident. Another kind of sample, certain kinds of exchanges and processing of information and the getting of body parts into the right places at the right times. This all has to happen for creatures to survive. But it didn't have to look like this. How then do we discover the good for which a creature is made? Where can we find a goodness detector? Providentially, what I'm saying is each of us is a goodness detector. We must reckon with the fact that when it comes to learning about the world, there is finally no substitute for the human agent. We are the essential, properly scientific instruments. The implications of these observations, I think, are invigorating. What creatures really are can be found only in knowing their unique goodness, much of which is manifest at the level of the whole organism. And the only instrument capable of discerning this is the human being. This does not imply that creaturely goodness is immediately and transparently accessible just in casual observation. It doesn't mean it's easy. But it does suggest that creaturely goodness is accessible through the sorts of observation that even the non-specialists like you and I are capable of. A degree in cellular biology, a well-equipped laboratory, foliations of your cat's brain under the microscope, none of this has priority in understanding the creaturely good of your cat beyond what you've already observed in 5 years of caring ownership. I focus this line of reasoning upon non-human organisms. This is only because I believe I can make my point most efficiently that way. But the argument holds for all created things generally, and of course, the most rewarding reflections along these lines will be aimed at the special case of human beings, those made in God's own image. But I must leave this as an exercise for the listener. But as a sort of a prompt, if a glorious good beyond the tools of survival is discernible in a coral snake or a common grackle, how much more so in a human being, in your spouse, in your child, or in your steadfast friend? This would be incorporating this aspect into the empirical science might be what we should call a true science of the good, a supplemented empirical science. I can hear the objection. But how would this true science of creaturely goods be objective and demonstrable? Since it wouldn't rely on empirical methods, wouldn't it just be an incoherent pooling of subjective impressions? Like, I think the unique good of being a lion is creaturely majesty. Oh, well, I think the unique good of being a lion is symbolic power, and just, degenerating into unresolvable disagreements like this. It is true that this true scientific exploration of creation will not be demonstrably objective in the way that strictly speaking, empirical science is. As such, it would not solve the long-standing problem of moral disagreement that motivated the science of morality. But because the essence of creation is tied up with the good, there's no way to study what it is via demonstrable empirical means. It follows that study of the goodness of creation inevitably must be experiential, hermeneutical, and philosophical in addition to being empirical. Importantly, although I'm not going to argue for this here, I think it must ultimately be confessional. True, this path takes us beyond pure empirical demonstration. But again, if anyone would wish to see the good of creation, there is no alternative. And at any rate, we should not neglect studying something just because it is impossible to do in a way that would compel the universal assent of human beings. It may strike you as unlikely that there would be any serious attempt by the sciences to move in these directions. Unlikely, even if arguments like mine were both sound and widely known. I completely agree. The biggest barrier to this true science of the good is an instrumentalizing bent characteristic, I would say, of our civilizational order. The institutions which organize, house, and fund our study of the world tend to approach the world as a part heap, completely at our disposal for our projects of material comfort, economic profit, and accumulation of power. Given these objectives, the practical objection to my argument is, this so-called true science of the good wouldn't seem to be a very useful science. But I would ask, useful for what? Useful for generating economic profit? Useful for technological development? For amassing power? Admittedly, no. A true science of the good would not be nearly so useful for these ends. But this may be more of a feature than a bug. For I think it would become more difficult to exploit creation for our amoral, or at least often amoral ends, if we were constantly attempting to understand and appreciate the unique good of each creature. The potential for material benefit and technological development are only part of God's telos for creation. We must grapple with the fact that insofar as we overlook and minimize the fundamental non-instrumental good of creation, then to that extent, our objectives diverge from God's objectives. The challenge facing all of us, I think, is to recognize that creation is not finally about what we can do with it, how we can use it to increase our pleasure, wealth, or power. It's about whether we can accept and steward the good things God has made with delight in them for what God made them to be. The challenge is whether we can appreciate nature as a gift. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this invitation to return to more Aristotelian metaphysical way of thinking about science and phenomenology. Yeah, I was wondering if you that Maurice Merleau-Ponty didn't make an appearance in your. Anyway, it's time for our response. Our respondent tonight is Dr. David Robinson. Thank you, David, for being here. David is the Paul Stevens Chair for Marketplace Theology and Leadership here at Regent College, freshly installed in his position, just briefly. It was a great occasion. And he directs the Master of Arts in Leadership, Theology and Society here at Regent, the Maltz program. His current research focuses on the theological ethics of human work, as well as approaches to sustainability, personal, corporate, and environmental sustainability. David has also previously researched and published on the relation of theology and science, particularly in the field of ethics, which makes him the perfect respondent for tonight's lecture. So please help me welcome David Robinson.
Good evening, everyone. Glad you could be here with us tonight and look forward to your questions and engagement as well. But let me begin with mine. I'm delighted to offer a response to Dr. Nedelisky's work, both with respect to his co-authored book, Science and the Good, as well as to tonight's lecture, where he goes beyond the book into an interesting new project. I'll begin with a word of praise. What an excellent book this is. It's written with clarity and rhetorical flair. Although it addresses a complex topic, it is eminently readable. And so I have interest, as Jens mentioned, in ethics as well as the theology and science interface, and I found this to be a real page turner. The authors artfully deflate the pretensions of the new moral scientists, revealing which of their claims are actually based on empirical science and which are part of a proclivity to overreach. As the moral scientists address audiences from politics to business, this is a widely relevant discussion. So I think of books aimed at business leaders, which talk about whether competition or cooperation is more grounded in nature, as one example, and give tips on how to succeed by following nature. I could go on, but I'll simply give a hearty recommendation. Read this book. Because in the spirit of the Houston Center events, I'd like to take a more critical line of engagement tonight. But I do so out of deep respect for the quality and significance of Dr. Nedelisky's work. It's interesting to hold this pair of projects together. So the book and the first part of the lecture, and then the second part of the lecture, the book and the first part are asking for a more modest account of science and challenges overreach by those who are doing moral science. But the second part of the lecture and what he's doing constructively is quite an ambitious recovery of an older natural philosophy, but done with respect to modern scientific discourse. So in response to tonight's lecture, I want to offer two invitations. They draw on your references to tragedy, both in your book's subtitle, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality, as well as your mention of your own tragic sensibility late in the book. So first, I want to invite you to a more tragic view of nature. And second, I want to invite you to a less tragic view of science. So a more tragic view of nature, less tragic view of science. As you can see, I have a certain ambivalence about appeals to the tragic. First, to invite you to a more tragic view of nature. In the book, you make the point that definitions are critical, but although you give a concise definition of the good, the normative realm with a special focus on objective value, I don't see a definition of nature. That's a tall order, of course. As David Hume remarks, no word, quote, is more ambiguous and equivocal, close quote, than nature. But the way you present nature is rather sanguine. I take your point on the gratuitousness in the beauty of creatures and see an aspect of gift in it. Darwin also wrote in evocative terms about creatures with, quote, forms most beautiful and most wonderful, close quote. Yet in the same celebrated passage on the entangled bank, he's clear-eyed about how these creatures emerged from, quote, the war of nature from famine and death, close quote. And in personal correspondence, he struggled to believe in a good creator in light of the gratuitous cruelty of creatures. So he points out the way that cats play with mice, Jeffrey would do this as well, and the way that parasitic wasps feed on caterpillars. And so since Darwin's time, awareness of mass extinction events and the widespread catastrophe of those make me wish for a more functionally adequate world at times. These realities have led to a minor revival of theodicy in the work of, say, Christopher Southgate, and that is a theodicy without a fall. So you're no longer attributing nature's wastefulness or predation and death to human sin and responsibility. You're seeing this as more intrinsic to the good creation God has made. So the question then is, what do the evident harms in nature, or to use a more contested term, natural evils, mean for your identification of the good in nature? Returning to your question of the good, it seems that you're operating on two different levels. When it comes to humans, you refer to their good as involving relationship to other people as well as to God. So there's a more transcendent reference to this, and the telos would be more transcendent in that respect. When it comes to other animals, you refer to their good more proximately without overt reference to the divine. So the lion's visceral majesty, the cat's ability to creep, stalk, and pounce. That second, more immanent construal of creaturely good is something that I don't think requires a confessional stance to recognize. So as a theological compatibilist, I don't feel the need to play these off against each other. And so I think that the recognition of those goods in creaturely things can be a point of meeting between scientists who claim a particular faith and scientists who do not. Second, then, towards a less tragic view of science. Now, you have a clear respect for the scientific endeavor. Indeed, part of the power of your book comes from your defense of a properly modest account of scientific inquiry against its exploitation for other agendas. You also affirm the good of what you call level 3 findings in the moral science. That is, findings that illumine the human capacity for morality, even if they do not give us moral content. I think that's a very helpful level 1, 2, 3 distinction that you make to deflate some of the claims of moral science. But it's a good you acknowledge, and a contribution that science makes to our understanding of morality. Nevertheless, there are times when you depict scientific institutions in rather dark terms. Quote from tonight, "The institutions which organize, house, and fund our study of the world tend to approach it as a part heap completely at our disposal for our projects of material comfort, economic profit, and accumulation of power," close quote. In contrast to such an approach, you say that the observation of the whole organism is central, using the example of the visceral majesty of the lion. And you say that, quote, "no contemporary biological investigation is going to notice this," close quote. Now, I find that a remarkable statement. You say that, and later when you go on to talk about biologists investigating at the genetic and cellular level, but then also being able to speak to animals as parts of species and within ecosystems, I'm not clear how that's not part of a holistic organismic account. So you seem to be fixed on this medium account as perceived by ordinary people. But if you're looking for a whole account, all of those things seem to factor in. And it seems to me that scientists are also working with whole organism accounts. I mean, I'll give you one example. And I will concede that there has been an emphasis on, say, genetics. The past centuries brought us marvelous work in genetic science. So it's understandable that some reductive accounts have emerged in which it seems that organisms are simply genetically programmed. But science self-corrects, and recent work in evolutionary biology seeks to return to a more organism-centered approach. You mentioned this in passing. I would add the example of niche construction theory, which calls attention to the way organisms modify their environments in ways that alter selective pressures on themselves and others. Beavers building dams, northern flickers excavating nests, and so forth. This has been controversial, of course, through the larger program of an extended evolutionary synthesis, as it's called, but I simply raise it to demonstrate that whole organisms and their proximate goods in a given environment seem to me be a clear part of the agenda for biology. Moreover, scientists often go beyond their own technical endeavors to celebrate and advocate for the good of creatures. Take E.O. Wilson. So Wilson and his book, his work in sociobiology, make a brief appearance in your book as a contributor towards the new science of morality. You make reference to his, quote, fearless though naive philosophizing, close quote. Here's a scientist who speaks clearly and passionately about what he calls the objectivity of nature and the need to preserve the good found in organisms and species. Wilson speaks of what he calls the grizzly bear effect of environmental ethics. We may never or rarely see certain rare animals, although bears are quite common up here. You may see one in our neighborhood. Nevertheless, quote, they proclaim the mystery of the world, close quote. They are, goes on, they are jewels in the crown of creation, close quote. Wilson has therefore been a strong advocate of protecting biodiversity, a concept itself in its history that challenges any strict demarcation between science and culture. The related quest to slow and reverse human-caused extinctions is a task that requires significant scientific expertise. And he would say that that's motivated in part by our biophilia, a love that we have for life. It's also a task that requires scientists to make the case to ordinary people of faith who do not see the goods currently at stake, and that's what Wilson tries to do with respect to communities of faith. Of course, as a theologian, there's a great deal more that I would want to say about creaturely life and the human role within it, but I have learned from scientists who do not share my faith about the more proximate goods of creatures, the creatures with whom we share a world. My closing comment, then, is in the interest of alliance building, and so it gets more to the political dimensions of your book and some of this work in political epistemology. And here I wonder about the cost of attributing moral nihilism to those with whom you disagree when they don't claim it for themselves. So there are, of course, those who are overt about their moral nihilism. You reference Green and Rosenberg, for example, whom you deftly criticize in the book. But there are others, Flanagan and Churchland, for example, who are more ambiguous and don't claim the term for themselves. So it seems to me there's a risk in pressing their ambiguity in the direction of the nihilists, and also by